Okay, have you ever, like, just known something was wrong?
Mm.
Like, deep down, not because someone told you, not even because of some rule,
Mm.
but just because it felt wrong.
Yeah, yeah, like a gut punch
Exactly.
of wrongness.
Yeah.
And that feeling right there, that's a big part of what we're going to be looking at in this deep dive. Moral phenomenology. So we're not just talking about the theories of right and wrong,
Mm.
but like what it's like to experience those things, to actually live a moral life, what that feels like.
Yeah, and the really cool thing is we have this great resource to help us explore this, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on moral phenomenology. It's like packed with different philosophical perspectives
Yeah.
on how to make sense of these really intense experiences, going from like super introspective stuff to like hardcore analysis.
Exactly. And what makes it so compelling is that it gives, like you, the listener, it gives you tools to dissect your own moral experiences. Like, have you ever wondered how you know something's wrong or right? Like moral phenomenology, it gives you this framework for analyzing, how you perceive these situations, how you feel about them, the judgments you make, even like how you end up acting.
Right.
And you'll see that there are a lot of different ways of understanding this process.
So our mission today is we really want to go deep with this, to uncover this whole world of moral experiences and like see how philosophers try to make sense of all this.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think this could give us some new ways of thinking about those, big ethical questions that I think everyone really struggles with at some point. So let's start from the beginning. What exactly is moral phenomenology? As a field of study, I mean.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the word phenomenology, it can be used in a couple ways. Like sometimes it's just referring to like the subjective feel of an experience, like the particular sting of, regret. But as a field of study, it's really about examining like the structures of our consciousness, how our awareness is directed towards different objects. And moral phenomenology, it takes that general approach and applies it specifically to, how we experience morality.
So it's about understanding the architecture of how we experience right and wrong and good and bad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The aim is to describe these experiences using our own first-person perspective as a starting point.
Yeah.
But it doesn't stop there. Moral phenomenology also wants to understand how these experiences matter for things like, metaphysics, questions about like the nature of moral truths, and also for normative ethics. So that's, what principles should actually guide our actions.
And the Stanford entry, it highlights two main philosophical traditions, right, within moral phenomenology.
Yeah, that's right. So you've got the phenomenological tradition, which, really took off with Husserl. And then you have the approach that's aligned with the analytic philosophy of mind. And while their methods are different, they both really focus on, moral experience itself.
Okay, so that's a huge landscape of experiences. Where do we even begin with all this?
Well, it helps to start by looking at the different types of moral experience. That gives us a concrete framework for organizing everything. And the entry, it starts with something called moral perception.
Moral perception.
Uh-huh.
That's interesting. Is that the idea that you can just like see that something's morally wrong, like almost like you see a red light or something?
In a general sense, yeah. It involves using your senses. So, sight, hearing, touch, all of that, to register something as morally significant. So, for example, you see someone inflicting pain on an animal, and you experience that as morally wrong. Or you hear a hateful, prejudiced remark, and you just immediately recognize, the moral problem with that.
Okay, so it's that immediate moral take that we have when we witness stuff. Okay.
But there's also a more specific and quite a bit more debated definition of moral perception. And this is the idea that we can directly perceive like a moral property, like the injustice of something, like it's part of your perceptual experience. So it's not just that you see someone stealing food and then you conclude it's wrong, but it's like the wrongness is a component of what you see.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a big claim.
Yep.
That wrongness can be perceived, like we perceive color or a shape.
Right.
What are the implications of that kind of thinking?
Well, it has big implications for how we think about moral knowledge, right? Because if we can perceive moral properties, then that's like a direct path to knowing right from wrong.
Right.
But it also raises the question, why do people disagree so much about morality if we're all perceiving the same moral reality?
Right.
So yeah, that's a big point of contention, especially in analytic philosophy.
Yeah, so you're actually seeing the act itself.
Right.
Versus the wrongness of the act.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. What's the next type of moral experience?
Okay, so next up we have moral emotions. So these are feelings that have this moral weight to them. They can be positive, like gratitude, if someone does something kind for you, or respect for someone's, integrity. Or they can be negative, like shame when you do something wrong.
Yeah.
Or indignation when you see someone else being mistreated.
Yeah, like that. We've all felt those things, that sinking feeling of guilt when
Exactly.
you mess up,
Right.
or like that burst of anger when you see injustice.
Absolutely. And these emotions, they have a very distinct feel to them. Like they have this powerful what it's likeness. And what's interesting philosophically is that there might be a link between these emotions and our moral judgments. Like some
Yeah.
people argue that moral judgments are actually embedded in our emotional responses.
How could that work? Do you have an example?
Yeah, so imagine you see someone being like unfairly fired from their job.
Yeah.
You feel that outrage, right?
Yeah.
So one way to understand that feeling is that it contains the judgment, this is unfair. Right, the emotion isn't just like a neutral feeling that happens alongside a judgment,
Right.
but the judgment is part of that emotional experience.
Yeah.
And this actually challenges the traditional view that, reasoning comes first and then the emotional reaction.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So like our gut reactions
Right.
are more complex than we think.
Exactly.
Okay, what about moral judgment itself as like a separate category?
Right. So moral judgment in this context is that conscious experience of thinking a moral proposition. So it could be judging your own actions or your character
Yeah.
or evaluating someone else's behavior. It could even be judging an institution.
Yeah.
It's the act of like mentally saying yes or no to a moral claim.
So it's the act of saying to yourself, that was wrong,
Yeah.
or this is the right thing to do.
Exactly. And the Stanford entry highlights that there might be different types of moral judgments that have different feels.
Hmm.
So Maurice Mandelbaum, he talked about direct versus removed moral judgments. So have you ever noticed a difference between like the sense of obligation that you feel in a situation versus how you judge like a similar situation that happened to someone else or something that happened a long time ago?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, like when I'm facing a moral choice myself, it feels very different than when I'm reflecting on like somebody else's dilemma.
Exactly. That immediacy, that's what Mandelbaum was trying to capture with this idea of direct moral experience.
Gotcha.
And he also talked about, judging what we ought to do, our obligations, versus judging what's good or bad, our values.
Right.
And these types of judgments, they might have their own distinctive feel to them. We also have, those spontaneous moral intuitions that feel very different from judgments that come from like careful thought and deliberation.
Right. So that quick flash of moral insight
Exactly.
versus that reasoned conclusion. Yeah, they definitely feel different.
They do. They do. And that leads us to the next category, moral deliberation.
Okay, so moral deliberation. That sounds like, actively trying to figure out the right thing to do.
Exactly. It's that process of considering different, moral claims, weighing reasons for and against, and trying to reach a conclusion or make a decision.
Yeah.
It's that mental wrestling.
It's that mentor before you actually do anything.
Right. Yeah, that experience of thinking through the scenarios,
Right.
trying to see the consequences,
Exactly.
and picking the best path forward. Okay.
Exactly. And then we come to moral agency.
Moral agency. Okay, so this is like the actual experience of acting in the world.
Yeah, it's about exercising that capacity to act.
Yeah.
So that includes making decisions, so, that feeling of choosing, but also intending, trying, and actually doing things that matter morally.
So it's not just thinking about right and wrong, but that feeling of being the one to choose and to actually act. Exactly. And there's some really interesting ideas about this. So Julia Annis, she talks about the flow experience that virtuous people sometimes have,
Yeah.
where their actions just feel effortless,
Right.
right? And they're aligned with what's right.
Fine.
Now, Hubert and Stuart Dreyfus, they talk about ethical comportment. So that's when experts in a moral domain, like they just intuitively know what to do
Right.
without having to think about the rules.
Right. It's like a really skilled musician
Exactly.
who just knows what to play.
Yeah, think of a really compassionate person
Yeah.
responding to someone in need,
Yeah.
right? Their actions just feel so natural.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Totally.
yeah, and it's important to remember these categories, they're not like separate boxes.
Right.
They all bleed into each other.
Yeah.
Like our emotions can definitely influence our judgments. Moral deliberation, it involves lots of smaller moral judgments along the way. It's all connected.
Right. It's all part of the same moral fabric of our life.
Ex-
Okay, so we've got a sense now of what moral phenomenology is trying to understand. But how do philosophers actually study this stuff? Like, what are the main ways they approach it?
Okay, well, this is where those two traditions, the analytic and the phenomenological, they really go their separate ways.
Right.
So both of them are looking at first-person experience, but they do it very differently. and they have different goals.
Okay, well, let's start with the analytic tradition. What kind of tools and methods do they use?
Well, the analytic approach is generally empirical and a posteriori. So that means they rely on experience and observation to figure things out. And they often use introspection, so like looking inward at your own thoughts and feelings to get data about moral experiences. And they're often trying to find general psychological truths about these experiences.
So they're using introspection like kind of like a scientist who
Yeah.
observes the natural world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. And the entry, it distinguishes between two main ways of using introspection. So one is just direct introspection. So you just focus your attention on what you're experiencing right now,
Yeah.
and you try to describe, so like, you could try to describe the feeling of remorse that you have after breaking a promise.
Yeah, so like paying attention to what's going on in your mind.
Exactly.
Right.
But the entry points out that direct introspection, it can have its limitations, especially when we're trying to settle some of these philosophical debates. So for example, do visual experiences represent high-level properties like causation or moral wrongness?
Yeah.
Can you just introspect and say, like, yes, I see the wrongness?
Right. It's like
Okay.
our interpretations can get mixed up with what we're actually seeing.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And that's where the second use of introspection comes in. Phenomenal contrast arguments. So these arguments, they work by comparing the differences between two experiences to draw conclusions about the nature of those experiences.
Okay, can you give us an example of how a phenomenal contrast argument would work? In the context of a moral experience.
Yeah, so imagine two scenarios. So in one, you see someone trip and they accidentally spill a drink on someone.
Okay.
And in the other, you see someone deliberately trip someone else,
Okay.
right? And they spill their drink. Now, visually, those two scenes might be very similar,
Right.
but your emotional response is going to be very different.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And your immediate moral judgment is going to be very different. So a philosopher using a phenomenal contrast argument might say, well, the best way to explain this difference is that in some sense you're perceiving the intentionality and maybe even the wrongness
Okay.
more directly in this second scenario.
Ah, so the difference in our experience
Yeah,
points to a difference in what our experience is actually like, representing.
exactly. But it's important to note that introspection is debated. Whether it's reliable, how to interpret it,
Right.
it's a whole other discussion. But the main thing is that the analytic tradition is often using introspection to get this evidence about moral experience, and then using reasoning to draw conclusions, which contrasts with the phenomenological tradition.
Right, okay, so let's talk about the phenomenological tradition, starting with Husserl. What are their methods for studying these moral experiences?
Well, the Husserlian phenomenological tradition, it's very different. It's a priori. So that means it's looking for necessary and universal truths about experience,
Okay.
not just contingent psychological facts.
Right.
They want to understand the essential structures of intentionality, so that fundamental directedness of our consciousness towards an object.
Okay, so instead of looking for like general patterns in how people experience morality, they want to find the underlying universal essence of moral experience.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Their goal is to articulate what that fundamental structure of different types of moral experience is.
Right.
And they use certain tools. So the most famous one is the phenomenological reduction.
Okay, the phenomenological reduction. That sounds very technical. What's that all about?
Yeah.
They-
It can sound intimidating,
Mm.
but the basic idea is that you suspend your natural attitude. So your everyday belief that the world exists and there are objects in it.
Yeah.
Husserl called it bracketing, like you're putting aside the question of whether things actually exist the way we think they do.
Yeah.
And instead, you're focusing on your experience and how the object appears to your consciousness.
So you're not denying that the world exists, but you're shifting your focus to the structure of your experience.
Exactly. The goal is to see what Husserl called the intentional correlation.
Mm.
So how the experience and the object, how they're linked in our consciousness, regardless of whether the object actually exists.
Okay.
Right. And this reduction, it's supposed to reveal that fundamental relationship
Yeah.
between how an experience feels subjectively and what it's about, its content.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. And then there's this thing called imaginative variation.
Yeah. So imaginative variation, that's a key method for uncovering these essential structures. So you systematically change different aspects of an experience in your imagination to see what's necessary for it to be that kind of experience. So you try to imagine the experience without a certain element.
Okay.
If you can still conceive of it as the same type of experience, then that element, it's not essential.
Okay.
But if you can't imagine it without that element, then that element is considered essential to the experience.
Yeah, can you give an example of how imaginative variation works with a moral experience?
Yeah.
Like guilt?
Yeah, sure. So think about guilt. So guilt, it involves a feeling of distress or unease,
Mhm.
and it's directed at something you think you did wrong. Now try to imagine feeling that distress, but without thinking you did something wrong. Would
Yeah.
that still be guilt?
Yeah.
Or imagine, recognizing you did something wrong, but you don't feel bad about it. Would that be guilt? So phenomenologists would say that both the distress and the recognition of wrongdoing, they're both essential to the experience of guilt. Because if you take one away, the experience changes completely.
So by playing around with the different features in our minds, we can try to find those core unchanging elements.
Exactly. And because this method, it focuses on those essential structures that would hold for any experience of that type, not just the experiences of individuals. The results are considered a priori truths.
Hmm.
So necessary and universal.
Great. And that's very different from the analytic tradition's focus on those empirical psychological generalizations.
Right.
Okay, so how do these insights from moral phenomenology, how do they connect to metaethics, those bigger questions about morality itself?
Okay, well, if certain moral experiences, like moral perception, if they present us with real moral properties, like the wrongness of an action, then that could be evidence for moral realism.
Yeah.
The view that moral properties exist objectively. It can also give us a basis for saying that we can have justified moral beliefs and even moral knowledge
Yeah.
through these experiences.
So if I have a strong feeling of indignation, when I see unfair treatment, and if that feeling is actually a way of me apprehending that injustice, that suggests that injustice is a real thing. It's not just a subjective reaction I'm having.
That's the idea.
Okay.
And if moral experiences really do have this kind of content, then it also supports the view that moral judgments can be true or false.
Right.
Right, because they're making claims about these facts.
Yeah.
And this has big implications for whether, we can think of ethics as objective.
Right. Okay, let's dig into some of these specific areas of metaethics. How does moral phenomenology change our understanding of moral perception and, the debate surrounding it?
Well, as we mentioned before, the big question is whether we can literally perceive those moral properties
Yeah.
as part of what we see or hear or feel.
Yeah.
And this is a big debate in analytic philosophy.
And that example of Harmon's cat, that comes up a lot.
And he does, yeah.
But the thought that when you see someone setting a cat on fire, you don't just see the flames in the cat, but you also see the wrongness
Right.
of the situation.
Exactly. And there are two really different ways to think about that.
Right.
So one is that the wrongness is actually part of your visual experience.
Okay.
That's the thesis of moral perception.
Okay.
The other way is that you see the non-moral facts. So, the gasoline, the cat suffering, and that triggers a moral judgment.
Yeah.
But the wrongness itself isn't part of what you see.
Right.
It's a reaction to what you see.
Okay.
And for a while, the dominant view was that we don't directly perceive moral qualities. Like philosophers like W.D. Ross, they said that properties like rightness are what they called resultant attributes.
Yeah.
So an action is right because of other features,
Okay.
not because rightness is like a thing in itself. Like we don't perceive it directly like we perceive the color blue.
Gotcha. But this emphasis on what they call the rich content view of perception kind of opens the door for the moral perception thesis.
Yeah, it does. It does. So if our everyday visual experience, if it can include high-level properties like, seeing a tree or a car,
Right.
then maybe it can also include moral properties. The question is, how much information are we getting directly from our senses?
Right. Okay. So those phenomenal contrast arguments are being used to say that maybe we do perceive moral properties.
Right. So think back to Werner's argument, comparing someone with empathy and someone without, witnessing the burning cat. So the argument is that the difference in their experience, it can be best explained if we say that the person with empathy is actually seeing the wrongness. It's not just an inference they're making.
Okay. But aren't there counter arguments to those phenomenal contrast arguments?
Of course. So Verinen, for instance, he says, okay, even if the property of wrongness is part of the person's overall experience, that doesn't mean it's part of the visual experience specifically.
Okay.
It could be coming from their emotional response. He also suggests that the moral judgment, it could just be a really fast inference, like unconscious,
Yeah.
based on the non-moral details and the person's moral beliefs.
Okay. So we don't really know for sure whether we see morality like we see other things in the world.
That's right.
Okay. What about moral emotions? How do phenomenologists see their role, and how does that connect to metaethics?
Okay, well, For a lot of phenomenologists, particularly the ones focused on axiology, so thinkers like Husserl, Scheller, Hartman, they see moral perception and emotion as deeply connected to how we experience values,
Right.
including moral values. They say that feelings and emotions are fundamental to even grasping what's valuable or not.
Okay, so going back to Harmon's cat,
Right.
that feeling of disgust or horror that we feel, that's not just a reaction to the wrongness,
Right.
but that's how we become aware of the wrongness.
That's right. They see intentional feelings as directly apprehending those value objects.
Yeah.
Like, it's not that we value something because we feel a certain way,
Okay.
but the feeling itself is how we access a pre-existing value.
Okay, so there's this distinction between like weak and strong value realism, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So weak value realism says that perceiving value, it involves an emotion that grasps something as valuable. So our horror at the cat burning,
Right.
it signifies that we value animal welfare.
Okay, so the value is connected to our responses and what we care about.
Right. Now, strong value realism, that goes a step further.
Okay.
It says that emotions directly grasp values that exist a priori.
Okay.
So values that exist independently of any particular object or experience,
Mm-hmm.
like Scheller's hierarchy of values, for example.
Right.
It suggests this preordained order of values that our feelings reveal to us.
So like goodness and justice, those exist objectively and our feelings give us direct access to them.
Yeah, kinda.
Okay.
So we apprehend these a priori values, and that shapes how we see specific things as good or bad.
Yeah.
So the value itself, it's not dependent on the object
Right.
or our reaction. The object just gives us the opportunity to experience that value, like take outrage at injustice. A strong value realist might say that we can feel outrage because we already understand the badness of injustice itself.
Okay, so there's a real difference in how they see the relationship between our emotions and moral reality. How does moral phenomenology affect how we understand moral judgment from a metaethical perspective?
Right. Well, as we discussed, phenomenologists see this connection between our feelings and seeing something under a certain as, what's called the hermeneutic as.
Yeah.
So we see an act of cruelty as wrong,
Yeah.
for example.
And that as leads to us making an actual judgment.
Exactly.
Okay.
The as points towards an is.
Gotcha.
So seeing cruelty as wrong, it leads to the judgment that it is wrong. We go from an implicit understanding to an explicit judgment.
And Mandelbaum's view was that all moral judgments have this essence that's rooted in our experience of like fittingness.
Yes. He said that regardless of what we're judging, all moral judgments come from that intuitive sense of whether a response is appropriate.
Okay.
And that was central to his view that morality is objective.
Interesting. So the very feeling of judgment, according to him, it points to something objective.
That's right.
Okay. What about moral deliberation? What can phenomenology tell us about that process and what are the implications?
Well, phenomenological axiologists, they see deliberation as the link between how we evaluate things and our actions. It's how we choose what gives meaning to our lives.
Okay.
So thinkers like Ricoeur, they emphasize the role of hesitation, that moment when you consider different possibilities
Right.
as part of decision-making. And Reinach, he had these thought-provoking observations about deliberation, like actions that seem really virtuous, they're less so if there's either no deliberation or there's way too much deliberation.
Right.
So our experience of virtuous action, it's not just about a rational calculation.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. Right.
It's more complicated than that. And then Dante argued that the feeling we have when we're deliberating, that feeling of trying to find the right answer, not just any answer, that supports moral realism
Yeah.
because it feels like we're searching for an objective truth.
Right. It doesn't feel like we're just choosing what we want to do.
Exactly. But as we've seen, Horgan and Timmons, they warn us about drawing metaethical conclusions just from that feeling. Like, just because it feels like we're dealing with objective facts doesn't mean that those facts really exist independently of us.
So our experience of deliberation, it might feel like we're engaging with moral facts, but it doesn't prove they're out there.
Right.
Okay, what about moral agency? How does phenomenology view our capacity to act morally, and what does that mean for metaethics?
Well, Husserl talked about this thing called the fiat, and that's like the act of intention, whether you're aware of it or not, that gets our actions going. And he saw desire as this key element, connecting what we see as good and what we want to do.
Okay.
So we want what we desire, and we desire what we see as valuable.
And he made this distinction between different types of willing, right?
Yeah. He talked about action will, which is more impulsive, like you grab a snack because you're hungry.
Right.
And decision will, which is more conscious and deliberate. So you choose to eat healthy food because it's good for you in the long run.
Right. So our actions can be automatic or really carefully thought out.
Exactly. And later on, Husserl also explored this idea of absolute loves. So these are like really deep commitments that create unconditional obligations for us. And this leans towards a kind of value realism, where our commitments reveal these inherent values that then create moral obligations.
Okay, so that sounds like a very personal view of morality.
Yeah, it can be seen that way. Now, in contrast, strong value realists like Scheller and Hartman, they propose these universal imperatives that come from this hierarchy of values.
Right.
But even Hartman acknowledged the tension between those universal demands and individual agency.
Right.
And other phenomenologists like Heidegger, they moved away from value theory and emphasized things like freedom and authenticity, like taking responsibility for your choices and creating meaning in your life. And this led to debates about, how much of our moral selves is shaped by like spontaneous decisions versus careful deliberation. And then you have constructivist accounts from people like Sartre and Beauvoir. And they said that values aren't something we discover. They're
Oh.
created through our choices and actions.
So it's not something objective we uncover, but something we make real.
Right. And finally, you've got the deontic phenomenologists like Levinas and Lugstrup.
Yeah.
They said that moral obligations, they come from that experience of encountering another person, like just seeing another human being creates an ethical demand.
It's amazing how all these different perspectives come from looking at our subjective experience of morality.
Mm.
So how does all of this connect to normative ethics, the question of what we should do?
Right. Well, moral phenomenology, it impacts how we think about those theories we use to guide our actions. So like Mandelbaum's defense of deontology, the idea that we can intuitively know our duties, that was based on his phenomenological analysis of how fitting this feels. And Scanlon's contractualism, although it's more analytic, it also looks at how we experience moral reasons.
And what about that debate between having like one moral principle or many, like monism versus pluralism? Does phenomenology have anything to say about that?
Yeah, it does. So some people use the distinction between regret and remorse to support pluralism,
Yeah.
like Ross's theory of prima facie duties.
Okay.
So the idea is that if there's only one moral duty, then you wouldn't feel remorse for not fulfilling another duty, even if it was overridden by a more important one.
Right.
But the fact that we do feel remorse suggests that the overridden duty still mattered.
Right, because on a pluralist view, those other duties still have a claim on us. Yeah.
Exactly. And this distinction between regret and remorse, it's also been used in the debate about atomism versus holism. So whether the importance of a moral reason is fixed or whether it depends on the context. So Mandelbaum, in his coworker example, he argued that the moral relevance of gratitude, it can completely disappear in certain situations. And that supports holism.
So how we experience moral dilemmas can actually give us insight into how morality itself works.
Exactly. And beyond these structural issues, phenomenological analysis can help us understand specific theories. So, like, for consequentialism, looking at the experience of pleasure and pain is crucial.
Yeah.
For deontology, understanding the experience of respect is important. And for virtue ethics, you want to explore the experience of virtue itself. And phenomenological axiologists, they're also engaged in normative ethics, sometimes leaning towards duty-based views, sometimes towards virtue-oriented approaches.
So this deep dive into moral phenomenology, it not only helps us understand our own moral experiences, but it also gives us a new lens for looking at ethical theories about how we should live.
Absolutely. It shows how important it is to pay attention to the complexity of our moral lives.
So I want to encourage you, as you go through your day, to really notice how you experience right and wrong. Do your experiences seem to support the idea of objective moral truth?
Yeah.
Or are they more like responses to values?
Right.
Or something completely different? This dive into moral phenomenology, it's just the beginning of a really fascinating journey, both personal and philosophical.
It is. And if you want to keep exploring these ideas,
Yeah.
the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy Entry is a fantastic resource. You can also look at some of the writings from these thinkers we talked about,
Right.
like Husserl, Scheller, Levinas.
Right.
There's just so much to discover. It's a really rich field of study.
Yeah.
And it offers amazing insights into our moral lives.
Yeah, absolutely.